There are moments in life when reality fractures so completely that you begin to question everything you thought you knew about the world, about love, about the people who were supposed to protect you. And in that fracturing, something ancient and primal awakens inside you, a survival instinct that has been sleeping beneath years of trust and tenderness, waiting for the earthquake that will finally shake you awake. This is a story about that awakening, about the moment when a woman named Alina discovered that the life she had been living was constructed on a foundation of lies so elaborate, so carefully architected, that it took her breath away, not just because of the betrayal itself, but because of the sheer creative energy that had gone into deceiving her. The hours and days and months of planning, the coordination, the secret phone calls, the parallel universe that existed right alongside her own reality. Invisible yet devastatingly real. Alina had been married to Marco for 14 years, and like many women who find themselves in this particular kind of nightmare, she had ignored the small inconsistencies, Chinese letter shifts in energy, the way her husband's sister Claudia had become increasingly involved in their lives over the past 2 years, always offering to help, always volunteering to manage this or that aspect of their household, always present in a way that felt supportive but that Alina's body. Her nervous system had begun to register as something else entirely, something that made her stomach tighten in a way she couldn't quite name. The human brain is extraordinary in its capacity for pattern recognition, and somewhere beneath conscious awareness, Alina's amygdala had been collecting data, filing away the strange moments, the unexplained absences, the way Marco's face would light up when his phone buzzed at certain times, the way Claudia would exchange glances with him across the dinner table, glances that lasted just a fraction of a second too long, that carried a weight Alina could feel but couldn't see. For months, Alina had dismissed these sensations as paranoia, as the insecurity that women are taught to pathologize, to medicate, to silence with positive thinking and trust exercises. And this is one of the cruelest aspects of intimate betrayal, the way it trains you to doubt your own perception, to gaslight yourself before anyone else has to label your intuition as anxiety and your awareness as suspicion. The neuroscience of this is both fascinating and heartbreaking, because what happens is that your nervous system is actually responding accurately to microsignals, to changes in vocal tone and body language and pheromones that your conscious mind hasn't yet organized into a coherent narrative. But you've been socialized to override these signals, to privilege the story you want to believe over the story your body is trying to tell you. And so you silence yourself, you apologize for your feelings. You become smaller and quieter while the deception grows larger and louder around you. The day Alina discovered the truth was ordinary in every way except one. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the kind of day when the light comes through the windows at a golden angle and makes everything look softer than it really is. And she had come home early from her teaching position at the university because a lecture had been canceled, walked into her house expecting the usual emptiness of a weekday afternoon, and instead found herself standing in the hallway, frozen, listening to sounds coming from upstairs that made her entire world telescope into a single terrible point of clarity. What she heard was laughter, intimate and unguarded, the kind of laughter that belongs to people who believe they are alone, who believe they are safe, and beneath that laughter she heard her husband's voice saying things she had not heard him say in years, speaking with a tenderness and playfulness that felt like a ghost of their early marriage. And then she heard another voice, a woman's voice, young and bright and completely at ease in Alina's home, in Alina's bedroom, in the life that Alina had built with her own hands and heart. The human body in moments of acute trauma does something remarkable and terrible. It floods your system with cortisol and adrenaline, preparing you for fight or flight, but it also creates a kind of perceptual shift, a slowing down of time that allows you to take in every detail with hyperclarity. And so Alina stood there, her hand still on the doorknob, her bag still on her shoulder, and she could feel her heart hammering so hard it seemed impossible that they couldn't hear it upstairs. Could feel the way her vision had sharpened until she could see individual dust motes floating in the afternoon light, could feel the exact texture of the air in her lungs, thick and heavy and almost solid. She didn't scream, she didn't run upstairs, instead she did something that surprised even her. She turned around, walked back to her car, drove to a coffee shop 3 blocks away and sat there for 2 hours, staring at nothing, while her mind tried to organize what had just happened into something she could comprehend, something she could survive. During those 2 hours, Alina's entire psychological architecture was reorganizing itself. Her brain was engaged in what neuroscientists call reconsolidation, the process by which existing memories and beliefs are retrieved and then restored with new information integrated into them. And this process is physically painful. You can actually feel it happening in your body, a sensation of things breaking apart and reforming, a kind of internal earthquake that leaves you dizzy and unmoored. She thought about the past 2 years, about how Claudia, Marco's younger sister, had become increasingly present in their lives after her divorce, how she had offered to help Marco with his business finances, how she had suggested she could manage some of their personal accounts as well since she was working in banking, how Marco had seemed relieved to hand over these responsibilities, how Alina herself had felt grateful for the help. For one less thing to manage in her already overwhelming life as a professor, a wife, a woman trying to hold everything together. She thought about how Claudia had encouraged Marco to take up running again, his old passion from college, how she had mapped out routes for him, how she had suggested he join a running club, how Lena had thought this was sisterly concern, supportive and kind, not understanding that what Claudia was actually doing was creating windows of time, blocks of hours when Marco would be legitimately absent, accountable to no one, free to do whatever he wanted under the cover of athletic self-improvement. She thought about how Claudia had helped them plan vacations, had suggested particular hotels, had even made some of the reservations herself, and now Alina understood with a sickening clarity that some of those reservations had never been for Alina at all. That while she had believed she and Marco were occasionally too busy to get away, he had been taking trips without her, trips that Claudia had arranged, trips that involved the woman whose laughter Alina had heard in her own bedroom. The sophistication of the deception was what made it most devastating, because this wasn't a simple affair. It wasn't just two people giving into attraction and making choices in the heat of moment. This was an elaborately constructed parallel reality, a secret life that required planning and logistics and infrastructure, and Claudia had provided all of it, had become the architect of her brother's betrayal, the project manager of Alina's humiliation. The enabler who made it possible for Marco to live in two worlds simultaneously, to be a husband in one and a lover in another, to never have to choose, to never have to face consequences, to exist in a state of permanent consequence-free pleasure while Alina carried all the weight of their actual shared life. What Alina didn't know yet, what she would discover in the coming days, was just how deep the infrastructure went. Claudia had not only managed the logistics of Marco's affair, she had managed the finances as well. She had opened credit cards in Marco's name, sometimes with his explicit knowledge and sometimes Alina would later learn without it, and these credit cards had been used to fund the affair, to pay for hotel rooms and restaurant meals and gifts and trips. To create an entirely separate stream of spending that existed outside of Alina and Marco's joint accounts, invisible to her, carefully hidden, systematically concealed. Claudia had even created fake business expenses, had manufactured invoices and receipts that made Marco's absences and expenditures look legitimate, had essentially built a financial maze so complex that Alina, even as the spouse, had no way of seeing what was really happening with their money, with their credit, with their future. When Alina finally went home that evening, Marco was in the kitchen making dinner as if nothing had happened, as if the afternoon had been perfectly normal. And she realized that he had no idea she had come home early, no idea she had heard anything, and this gave her a strange kind of power, a momentary advantage in a game she hadn't known she was playing. She didn't confront him that night. Instead, she began to investigate quietly and methodically. She checked their joint accounts, looked at credit card statements, went through emails, and what she found was a labyrinth of deception so vast that it took her several days just to map the basic contours, the secret credit cards, the cash withdrawals, the payments to hotels and restaurants she had never visited, the paper trail of a life that had nothing to do with her. There is a particular kind of pain that comes with discovering you have been living in a fiction, that the person you trusted most in the world has been performing their love for you while actually living their real life elsewhere. And this pain has a neurochemical signature. It involves the disruption of attachment bonds that are literally encoded in your nervous system, the breaking of neural pathways that have been built over years of shared experience. The collapse of the predictive models your brain uses to navigate the world. Lena felt this pain as a physical sensation, a hollowness in her chest that made it hard to breathe, a trembling in her hands that wouldn't stop, a sense of the ground falling away beneath her feet, and she understood in a very cellular way what trauma researchers mean when they talk about the body keeping the score, because her body was keeping this score, was writing it into her muscles and bones and blood, was storing it in places that wouldn't let her forget even if she wanted to. But alongside the pain, something else was beginning to grow, something fierce and clarifying, a kind of anger that wasn't hot and explosive but cold and precise. The anger of a woman who has been underestimated, who has been treated as if she were stupid or blind or too trusting to see what was happening right in front of her. And this anger, Alina discovered, could be channeled, could be used, could become a tool for reclaiming her own life. She thought about Carmen, a woman she had met in a support group years earlier when her sister had been going through a divorce. Carmen, who had discovered her husband's infidelity, and instead of falling apart had become methodical, strategic, had documented everything, had built a case, had protected herself financially and legally before ever confronting him. And Alina remembered how she had admired Carmen's strength but had also thought secretly that such calculated behavior seemed cold. Seemed to lack the spontaneity of real emotion, not understanding that real emotion includes rage, includes the desire for justice, includes the absolute necessity of protecting yourself when you realize no one else is going to do it for you. Alina spent 3 weeks gathering information, 3 weeks during which she continued to live with Marco, continued to sleep beside him, continue to perform the routines of their marriage while internally she was building a strategy. And this required a kind of dissociation that would have been impossible for her younger self, required her to split herself into the woman who was going through the motions and the woman who was watching from a distance, planning, preparing, getting ready. She discovered that there were 6 credit cards in total, 3 that Marco had opened himself with Claudia's help, and 3 that Claudia had opened in his name, possibly without his full knowledge, using her access to his personal information from when she had been helping with their finances. And these 6 cards had balances totaling over $87,000, money spent on an affair, on maintaining a fantasy, on building a life that had nothing to do with Alina but everything to do with destroying the life she thought she had. She also discovered the identity of the other woman, whose name was Valeria, who was 29 years old, who worked as a marketing consultant, who had met Marco through the running club that Claudia had suggested he join. And Alina spent hours looking at Valeria's social media, trying to understand what Marco saw in her, what she offered that Alina didn't, falling into the comparison trap that every betrayed woman knows, the cruel and pointless exercise of measuring yourself against someone else. As if there were a logic to betrayal, as if there were some quality you lacked that made the deception necessary, not understanding yet that affairs aren't about the person who is left. They're about the person who leaves, about their needs and failures and fears, about their inability to be honest, to be brave, to choose the harder path of real intimacy over the easier path of novelty and escape. The neuroscience of affairs is actually quite interesting. When someone engages in a secret relationship, their brain lights up in the same way it does with any high-risk, high-reward behavior. The dopamine surge of novelty combines with the adrenaline rush of secrecy to create an addictive cocktail of neurochemicals that makes the affair feel more intense, more passionate, more alive than the established relationship, which has settled into the calmer neurochemistry of attachment and comfort. This doesn't excuse the betrayal, but it helps explain why people who are otherwise capable of empathy and love can compartmentalize so effectively, can live in 2 worlds without apparent guilt, because in the affair world their brain is essentially high, is experiencing a chemical state that suppresses the prefrontal cortex's executive function and moral reasoning while amplifying the reward circuits, and over time this creates neural pathways that reinforce the behavior, that make it easier and easier to lie, to deceive, to maintain the double life. Lena thought about Isabel, another woman from the support group. Isabel, who had confronted her husband immediately upon discovering his affair, who had screamed and cried and demanded answers, and whose husband had responded by becoming defensive, by turning the situation around and making Isabel feel like she was the problem, like her reaction was the issue rather than his betrayal. And Alina understood that confrontation without preparation is often just another way of giving away your power, of allowing the other person to control the narrative, to shape the story, to make you into the villain of your own tragedy. Though she didn't confront Marco, not yet. Instead she consulted with a lawyer. Quietly and carefully she documented everything she had found. She took screenshots and made copies. She secured her own finances. She moved money from their joint accounts into a separate account in only her name, not all of it, just enough to ensure she wouldn't be left with nothing if Marco decided to empty everything in retaliation. And she prepared herself emotionally for what was coming, for the collapse of her marriage, for the grief and the rage and the terrible freedom of starting over. The day she finally acted was deliberately chosen. It was a Friday because she wanted the weekend to deal with the immediate fallout without the pressure of work obligations. And she waited until Marco left for what he said was a business trip, which she now knew was actually a long weekend with Valeria that Claudia had helped arrange, complete with a hotel reservation and fabricated conference materials. Once Marco was gone, Alina made 6 phone calls, 1 to each credit card company, and she explained the situation calmly and clearly. She told them that the cards had been opened and used without her knowledge or consent, that they were funding an extramarital affair, that she was in the process of divorce proceedings and needed the cards immediately canceled, and because she had documentation, because she had done her homework, because she was able to provide evidence of the deception. All 6 credit card companies agreed. They canceled the cards, they froze the accounts, they initiated fraud investigations, and just like that, the financial infrastructure of Marco's secret life collapsed. The power of this action was not just practical, though the practical implications were significant. It was also deeply psychological, because what Alina was doing was refusing to be complicit in her own betrayal, was refusing to continue funding the affair with her own financial security, was drawing a boundary so clear and absolute that it could not be misunderstood. And boundaries, neuroscience tells us, are essential for nervous system regulation. They allow your brain to distinguish between self and other, between what you can control and what you can't, between your responsibility and someone else's. And when we fail to establish boundaries, our nervous system remains in a chronic state of hypervigilance and dysregulation, because it never knows when the next violation might occur, when the next invasion of our space or dignity or resources might happen. Marco called her that evening, his voice tight with panic, his words tumbling over each other. Apparently he had been at dinner with Valeria when his credit card was declined. Then another card was declined, then another, and he had finally called Claudia in a panic. And Claudia had checked the accounts and discovered they had all been canceled. And Marco wanted to know what was happening, what Alina had done, why she would do something so extreme without talking to him first. And Alina felt a kind of calm settle over her that she hadn't felt in weeks, a clarity that came from finally being done with pretending, done with protecting him from consequences, done with making herself small so he could remain comfortable. She told him she knew everything about Valeria, about the affair, about Claudia's involvement, about the secret credit cards and the elaborate deception. And she told him that she had canceled the cards because she was done funding his betrayal, done being the fool who paid for her own humiliation, done enabling a fantasy life that was being built on the ruins of their marriage. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone, and Alina could hear him breathing, could hear the background noise of a restaurant or bar, could imagine him sitting there with Valeria, his face pale, his perfect evening destroyed, and she felt no satisfaction exactly, but she felt something close to it, a sense of justice, of equilibrium restored, of cause meeting effect. Marco tried to argue, tried to say that the cards were in his name, that she had no right to cancel them, that she was being vindictive and irrational. And this is typical of people who are confronted with their own bad behavior. They deflect, they attack, they try to make the person who has been harmed feel guilty for defending themselves. And Alina had to consciously resist the old patterns, the old training that told her to apologize to soothe his distress, to make things easier for him even at great cost to herself. Instead, she told him that he should speak to a lawyer, that she had already consulted one, that she would be filing for divorce, and that he should not come back to the house without arranging it with her first. And then she hung up, and she sat there in the quiet house in the home she had built with someone who turned out to be a stranger. And she cried, not the wild sobbing of fresh grief, but the deeper, older crying that comes from letting go of an entire vision of your life, an entire future you had imagined, an entire identity as someone's wife, someone's partner, someone's person. The grieving process for the end of a long relationship is complicated by the fact that you're not just mourning what you lost, you're also mourning what you never really had, the fantasy of the relationship you thought you were in, the person you believed your partner to be, and this kind of grief has layers upon layers. It unfolds over months and years, revealing new dimensions of loss as you move through different stages of acceptance and understanding. In the days that followed, Alina learned the full extent of Claudia's betrayal. Marco's sister called her, screaming, accusing Alina of ruining her brother's life, of being a controlling, jealous woman who couldn't handle the fact that Marco had found happiness. And the toxicity of this, the absolute distortion of reality it represented, was almost more painful than Marco's betrayal itself, because Claudia was a woman, was supposed to understand the sacred nature of women's solidarity, was supposed to know better than to facilitate the destruction of another woman's life. And yet she had not only facilitated it, she had architected it, had made it her project, had invested her time and energy and considerable intelligence into making sure her brother could have everything he wanted without having to face the messy reality of his choices. Alina hung up on Claudia without engaging, without defending herself, because she understood that there was no point in arguing with someone who had already chosen their narrative, who had already decided that Alina was the villain, who needed to believe that because the alternative, that they themselves were the villain, was too painful to contemplate. She thought about Patricia, another woman she had known who had been betrayed by her husband and his mother, who had worked together to hide money and plan for a divorce that would leave Patricia with as little as possible. And Patricia had told Alina once that the worst part wasn't even her husband's betrayal, it was his mother's. It was discovering that another woman, someone who had claimed to love her, who had called her daughter, who had shared holidays and birthdays and ordinary moments, had been plotting against her, seeing her as an obstacle rather than a person, as something to be removed rather than someone to be respected. Family betrayal, when it combines with intimate betrayal, creates a particular kind of pain because it attacks your sense of belonging, your sense of having a place in the world, your sense that there are people who will protect you and care for you no matter what. And when that sense is shattered, you're left unmoored in a way that is difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The divorce proceedings were bitter and complicated. Marco tried to claim that Alina's cancellation of the credit cards was financial abuse, that she had deliberately sabotaged his credit and his ability to conduct business. And his lawyer painted a picture of Alina as a vindictive, unstable woman who couldn't accept that her marriage had failed. And this is another cruelty of the family court system, the way it often allows the person who caused the harm to position themselves as the victim, to use the very act of self-defense against you to twist your boundaries into evidence of your unreasonableness. Alina's lawyer was able to counter this narrative with the documentation Alina had gathered, with the evidence of the affair, with the credit card statements showing the spending patterns, with emails between Marco and Claudia that proved they had been actively concealing the financial arrangements from Alina. And slowly, painfully, the truth emerged. The judge saw through Marco's attempts at manipulation, understood that Alina had acted to protect herself from ongoing financial exploitation. And the settlement reflected this understanding. But the legal victory, such as it was, didn't erase the psychological damage, didn't undo the months of living in a false reality, didn't restore Alina's sense of safety in the world. And this is what people who haven't experienced this kind of betrayal often don't understand. They think that once you leave, once you're free of the relationship, the healing begins and proceeds in a linear fashion, getting a little better each day until one day you're fine. But that's not how trauma works. That's not how the nervous system processes betrayal and violation and loss. Instead, healing happens in waves, in spirals. You make progress and then you backslide. You have good days where you feel strong and clear, and then you have bad days where you can barely get out of bed, where the weight of what happened presses down on you so heavily that you can barely breathe, where you question everything again, where you wonder if you should have stayed, should have tried harder, should have been different, even though you know intellectually that none of this was your fault. That you did nothing to deserve what happened to you. Alina began therapy, real therapy, not just the occasional session she had done before, but deep, committed work with a trauma-informed therapist who understood betrayal trauma specifically, who didn't minimize what had happened or rush her toward forgiveness, who gave her permission to feel all of her feelings, the rage and the grief and the shame and the confusion, and slowly in that therapeutic space. Alina began to understand the patterns that had made her vulnerable to this kind of deception in the first place, not because she was stupid or naive, but because she had been trained from childhood to prioritize other people's comfort over her own knowing, to doubt her perceptions when they conflicted with what others told her, to be the good girl, the accommodating woman, the person who made things easy for everyone else even when it made things impossibly hard for herself. Her therapist helped her understand that the ignored warning signs, the times when her body had tried to tell her something was wrong but she had overridden it with rational explanations and benefit of the doubt thinking, these weren't failures of intelligence or judgment, they were the result of complex conditioning, of messages she had received throughout her life about what it meant to be a good woman, a good wife, a good person. And these messages had taught her that trust was a virtue, that suspicion was a flaw. That asking questions was the same as being controlling, that wanting transparency was the same as being insecure, and all of these messages served to keep her compliant, to keep her from seeing what was really happening, to make her complicit in her own betrayal. The inner child work was particularly powerful. Alina began to connect with the part of herself that had learned very early that her needs were less important than everyone else's. The little girl who had watched her mother subordinate herself completely to her father, who had absorbed the message that women's intuition was hysteria, that women's anger was destructive, that women's boundaries were selfishness. And as Alina connected with that younger part of herself, she began to grieve for all the years she had abandoned herself, had ignored her own signals, had made herself smaller and quieter and less demanding in order to be loved. She discovered that her relationship with Marco had actually been recreating dynamics from her family of origin. Not exactly, but in the essential pattern she had been playing the role her mother had played, the role of the woman who maintains stability by not asking too many questions, who keeps the peace by accepting less than she deserves, who builds her entire identity around being the person everyone can rely on while having no one she can truly rely on in return. Marco, whether consciously or unconsciously, had been attracted to these qualities in Alina, had chosen her in part because she was someone who wouldn't demand too much, wouldn't push too hard, wouldn't insist on the kind of complete honesty and vulnerability that real intimacy requires. And this isn't to excuse his behavior, but it helps explain the pattern, helps explain how two people can create a relationship that looks functional from the outside while actually being deeply dysfunctional. While actually being based on an implicit contract that protects one person's comfort at the expense of the other person's dignity. As the months passed, Alina began to rebuild her life not just externally, finding a new apartment, rearranging her schedule, creating new routines, but internally rebuilding her sense of self, her sense of her own worth, her sense of what she deserved from the world and from other people. She joined a women's group specifically for those recovering from intimate betrayal, and she found enormous comfort in hearing other women's stories, in recognizing the patterns that cut across all their experiences, the ways they had all been gaslit and manipulated and made to feel crazy for sensing what was happening, the ways they had all struggled with the question of whether they could ever trust again, whether they could ever open themselves to love again, whether the risk of being hurt again was worth the possibility of real connection. The group included women at different stages of recovery, some who were just discovering the betrayal, raw and devastated, barely able to function, and others who were years out, who had done the work, who had rebuilt themselves, who had found new relationships or had chosen to remain single and were genuinely happy, genuinely whole, genuinely healed. And seeing these women, hearing their stories of survival and transformation, gave Alina something she desperately needed, which was hope. Evidence that the unbearable pain she was feeling wouldn't last forever, that there was a path through this darkness, that other women had walked it before her and emerged stronger, clearer, more themselves than they had ever been. She learned about the concept of post-traumatic growth, the research showing that people who experience significant trauma and do the work to process it often end up with greater psychological resilience, deeper empathy, clearer values, and more authentic relationships than they had before the trauma. Not because the trauma was good or necessary, but because the process of surviving it and making meaning from it can catalyze profound personal development. Lena thought about Carmen again, about how she had seemed cold and calculating in the way she had handled her own divorce. And Alina realized that what she had interpreted as coldness was actually clarity, was actually the clarity that comes from refusing to be swept away by your own emotions, from understanding that protecting yourself is not the opposite of being loving. It's a prerequisite for being able to love authentically, because you can't truly choose someone, can't truly commit to someone, if you haven't first established that you can survive without them, that your wholeness doesn't depend on their presence, that you have the capacity to stand alone if necessary. This is what the affair had stolen from Alina. Not just her marriage, not just her trust in Marco, but her illusion that she needed him, that she couldn't make it on her own, that her life only had meaning in relation to his. And losing that illusion was excruciating, but it was also liberating. It was also the beginning of real freedom, the beginning of a life built on her own choices rather than on her fear of being alone. She began to notice changes in her body, in her nervous system, the chronic tension she had been carrying for years, the tightness in her shoulders and jaw, the shallow breathing, the constant sense of vigilance. These began to ease slowly at first and then more noticeably. And she realized that she had been living in a state of low-grade stress for much longer than she had understood, that the relationship with Marco had required constant management and accommodation and suppression of her own needs. That it had never really been a place of rest, and now, alone in her own space, without having to constantly adjust herself to someone else's moods and needs and schedules, she was experiencing a kind of peace she couldn't remember feeling as an adult. Her therapist explained that this was her nervous system beginning to regulate, beginning to come out of the chronic sympathetic activation, the fight-or-flight state that had become her baseline. And as her nervous system calmed, her capacity for joy, for presence, for authentic connection began to return. She found herself laughing more easily, sleeping more deeply, noticing beauty in the world again. Small things like the way light fell through leaves, or the taste of good coffee, or the pleasure of a conversation with a friend. One afternoon, about a year after the divorce was finalized, Alina ran into Claudia at a shopping center, and for a moment they both froze, caught in the awkwardness of this unexpected encounter. And Alina braced herself for another scene, another accusation, another attempt to make her the villain of the story. But instead Claudia looked away, looked almost ashamed, and hurried past without speaking. And Alina realized that Claudia was probably dealing with her own consequences. That Marco's life had likely not turned out as planned, that the fantasy relationship built on secrecy and enabling rarely survives exposure to reality. That Valeria had probably discovered, as Alina had discovered, that a man who will lie to one woman will lie to any woman. That the capacity for deception doesn't disappear just because the object of deception changes. Alina felt a flash of compassion for Claudia, despite everything, because she understood now that Claudia's involvement in Marco's affair had likely been driven by her own pain, her own needs, her own complicated relationship with her brother and with men in general. That hurt people. That betrayal often comes from people who themselves have been betrayed, who are acting out their own unprocessed trauma. And while this didn't excuse the behavior, it helped Alina release some of the personal hatred she had been carrying, helped her see the situation in a more systemic way, helped her understand that she wasn't uniquely cursed or uniquely foolish. She had simply been caught in a pattern that plays out over and over in countless relationships, a pattern of deception and enabling and betrayal that is as old as human relationships themselves. She thought about Isabel again, about how Isabel had told her that the hardest part of recovery wasn't the initial shock, wasn't even the divorce proceedings. It was the months afterward when she had to face herself, had to face all the ways she had abandoned herself long before her husband had abandoned her, had to recognize her own patterns of codependency and people-pleasing and self-betrayal. Isabel had said that this recognition was simultaneously the most painful and the most liberating thing she had ever experienced. Painful because it meant acknowledging her own role in the pattern, not her role in causing the affair. That was entirely her husband's choice and responsibility. But her role in staying too long, in ignoring too many red flags, in accepting too little for too long, and liberating because once she saw the pattern clearly, once she understood her own conditioning, she had the power to change it, to choose differently, to build a different kind of life based on different values and different boundaries. Lena began dating again eventually, cautiously and with clear boundaries, and she was surprised to find that the betrayal, while it had made her more aware of red flags and potential deception, hadn't actually made her cynical, hadn't destroyed her capacity for connection or her willingness to be vulnerable. What it had destroyed was her willingness to override her own knowing, to dismiss her own concerns, to make herself small for someone else's comfort. And this meant that the relationships she formed now, even the casual ones, even the ones that didn't last, were more honest, more mutual, more respectful than her marriage had ever been, because she was showing up as herself, not as a performed version of what she thought someone wanted, and she was insisting that others show up authentically as well. And if they couldn't or wouldn't, she was able to recognize that quickly and walk away without the agonizing self-doubt and guilt that would have kept her trapped in the past. She started a blog about her experience, not using real names of course, but writing honestly about betrayal and recovery, about the ways women are conditioned to ignore their own knowing, about the neuroscience of trauma and the psychology of healing, about the specific dynamics of family-enabled affairs. And she was shocked by the response, by the hundreds and then thousands of women who reached out to tell her their own stories, stories that were eerily similar to hers. Stories of sisters-in-law and mothers-in-law and best friends who had enabled their partners' affairs, who had provided cover and logistics and financial support, who had chosen male comfort over female solidarity, who had participated in the construction of elaborate deceptions. And Alina realized that what had happened to her was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a social pattern that reflected deeper truths about how women are taught to relate to each other. About how we are taught to compete for male attention and approval rather than to support each other. About how we internalize patriarchal values that position other women as threats rather than allies. Through the blog, Alina connected with other women who had canceled credit cards, who had taken decisive financial action to protect themselves. And she heard story after story of how this action had been transformative, not just practically but psychologically, because it represented a refusal to remain a passive victim, a claiming of agency, a clear statement that I will not fund my own betrayal, I will not make this easy for you. I will not continue to resource a situation that is destroying me. And this kind of boundary setting, while it might seem harsh or vindictive to people who haven't experienced betrayal, is actually an essential part of healing. It's the nervous system saying enough. It's the self-protective instinct finally being honored rather than overridden. It's the moment when you stop performing accommodating femininity and start protecting your actual life. Alina also wrote about the financial literacy aspect, about how she had discovered that many women in long-term relationships have very little understanding of their own financial situation. They trust their partners to handle money. They don't ask questions. They don't look at statements. They don't understand credit scores or retirement accounts or the legal implications of joint versus separate finances. And this financial ignorance, while it might feel like trust, is actually a vulnerability. Is actually a way of giving away power. Because when you don't understand your own financial situation, you can't protect yourself, you can't make informed choices, you can't see the red flags when someone is exploiting you financially. And she began to teach other women about financial literacy, about how to check credit reports, how to understand credit card statements, how to monitor accounts, how to protect themselves, and this teaching became part of her own healing. Became a way of taking the pain she had experienced and transforming it into something useful, something that might protect other women, something that might prevent other women from going through what she had gone through. The question of whether she would ever trust Marco's family again, whether she would ever have any relationship with Claudia, came up repeatedly in therapy, and Alina struggled with this because part of her wanted reconciliation, wanted an apology, wanted Claudia to acknowledge the harm she had caused and to express genuine remorse. But another part of her knew that this was unlikely to happen. That people who are capable of that level of deception and betrayal rarely have the self-awareness or the courage to fully acknowledge what they've done. They usually remain defensive, usually continue to justify their actions, usually find ways to blame the victim for making them do it. And Alina had to grieve the fantasy of reconciliation, had to accept that Claudia was probably not going to transform into the person Alina needed her to be. Was probably not going to provide the closure Alina was seeking, and that Alina would have to create her own closure, would have to find peace within herself rather than waiting for it to be granted by the people who had harmed her. This is one of the hardest lessons of betrayal recovery, the understanding that the people who hurt you will probably never fully understand or acknowledge what they did, will probably never give you the apology you deserve, will probably never provide the validation and closure you're seeking, and so you have to learn to validate yourself, to close the chapter yourself, to make peace with the fact that some questions will never be answered, some hurts will never be directly addressed. Some relationships will never be repaired, and that this is okay, that you can still heal, that you can still move forward, that your recovery doesn't depend on their recognition of what they did. It only depends on your recognition of what happened and your commitment to honoring your own experience and healing your own wounds. 2 years after the divorce, Alina met someone new. A man named David who was a fellow professor at a different university who had also been through a difficult divorce, who understood betrayal and recovery from his own experience. And their relationship unfolded slowly, carefully, with a level of honesty and vulnerability that Alina had never experienced before. They talked about their fears and their histories. They established clear boundaries and expectations. They checked in with each other regularly about how they were feeling, about whether their needs were being met, about whether anything felt off or concerning, and this level of communication felt foreign to Alina at first, felt almost excessive. But she came to understand that this was what healthy relationship actually looked like. This willingness to be explicit rather than assuming. This commitment to ongoing honesty rather than comfortable silence. This practice of treating each other as full humans with complex inner lives rather than as characters in each other's personal narratives. David had a perspective on her story that was helpful. He pointed out that the cancellation of the credit cards, the action that Marco and Claudia had painted as vindictive and cruel, was actually an act of clarity, was actually Alina recognizing that she had a choice, that she could continue to be complicit in a system that was harming her or she could withdraw her participation. And that withdrawing participation isn't punishment, it's self-preservation. It's the basic recognition that you don't have to continue to resource things that are destroying you, that you have the right to say no, to pull back, to protect your own interests when no one else is going to do it for you. He helped her see that the narrative of the vindictive ex-wife is itself a tool of manipulation, is a way of making women feel guilty for protecting themselves, for establishing boundaries, for refusing to continue to accommodate and enable and sacrifice, and that women who have been betrayed are often trapped between two impossible standards. If they stay and try to forgive, they're told they're doormats with no self-respect. And if they leave and protect themselves, they're told they're bitter and vindictive. And both of these narratives serve the same purpose, which is to keep women focused on their own behavior rather than on the behavior of the person who betrayed them. Alina's relationship with her students changed as well. She found herself more attuned to the young women in her classes, more aware of the messages they were receiving about relationships and self-worth, more willing to speak honestly about the realities of intimate partnership, about the importance of financial independence and self-knowledge, about the difference between trust and naivety, about the necessity of maintaining your own identity and your own life even within a committed relationship. And her students responded to this authenticity. They told her that she was different from other professors, that she talked to them like they were real people with real lives rather than just academic performers. And Alina understood that her willingness to be honest about her own struggles and her own growth was actually making her a better teacher, was helping her connect with students in a way that purely academic instruction never could. She thought about Patricia, Isabel, Carmen, all the women whose stories had helped her navigate her own journey. And she understood that this is how women survive, through storytelling, through sharing, through breaking the silence that protects abuse and enables deception, through refusing to be ashamed of what happened to them, through transforming private pain into collective wisdom. And she felt grateful for these women, grateful for their willingness to be vulnerable. Grateful for the way they had lit the path for her when she couldn't see the way forward herself. She also thought about the women who were still silent, still trapped in relationships with people who were deceiving them, still overriding their own knowing, still funding their own betrayals, and she felt a fierce desire to reach them somehow, to tell them that their intuition is real, that their discomfort is information, that they don't have to wait for proof before they start protecting themselves, that they have the right to ask questions and demand transparency and refuse to participate in situations that feel wrong, even if they can't articulate exactly why they feel wrong. The anniversary of the day she had discovered the affair arrived, and Alina marked it quietly, privately, with a kind of ritual she had created for herself. She wrote a letter to her younger self, to the woman who had stood in the hallway hearing laughter from upstairs, to the woman who had driven to a coffee shop and sat there for 2 hours while her world fell apart. And in the letter she told that younger self that she was proud of her, that she had survived something that felt unsurvivable, that she had found strength she didn't know she had, that she had rebuilt her life from rubble and had created something even more beautiful and authentic than what had been destroyed. And as Alina wrote this letter, she cried, not from pain exactly, but from recognition, from acknowledgement, from the profound act of witnessing her own journey and honoring the courage it had required. She also wrote a letter to Marco. Though she didn't send it, in this letter she didn't rage or accuse, she simply told the truth. She told him that his choices had devastated her, but they hadn't destroyed her, that his betrayal had taught her things about herself she needed to learn, that she had finally understood she didn't need him, didn't need his validation or his presence or his love to be whole, and that she was grateful in a strange way for the clarity that his deception had forced upon her. Because it had broken open a life that looked functional but felt hollow, and had given her the opportunity to build something real. She told him that she forgave him, not because he deserved forgiveness, not because what he did was okay, but because carrying anger toward him was like drinking poison and expecting him to die, and she was done poisoning herself, done letting him occupy space in her heart and mind, done giving him power over her emotional state, and this forgiveness was for her, not for him, was her way of releasing the last threads of attachment. The last hope that he would somehow transform into someone capable of understanding what he had done and taking responsibility for it. The process of forgiving Claudia was harder, took longer, because Claudia's betrayal felt more personal in some ways, felt like a violation of woman-to-woman trust, felt like a choice to participate in the oppression of another woman. And Alina struggled with this, struggled with the question of whether forgiveness was even appropriate, whether it was just another way of accommodating bad behavior, whether there were some betrayals that shouldn't be forgiven. And her therapist helped her understand that forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, doesn't mean saying what happened was okay, doesn't mean allowing someone back into your life. It simply means releasing the emotional charge, releasing the hope that the past could have been different, accepting what is and moving forward without the burden of sustained bitterness. And eventually, Alina found her way to this kind of forgiveness, found her way to a place where she could think about Claudia without rage. Could understand that Claudia was acting from her own pain and limitation, could wish Claudia well in a genuine, if distant way, could hope that Claudia would eventually do her own work and recognize the harm she had caused, but could also accept that whether Claudia ever did that work or not was not Alina's concern, was not Alina's responsibility, was not something Alina needed to wait for or hope for or care about. 3 years after the divorce, Alina was offered a sabbatical, a chance to spend a year writing and researching, and she decided to use the time to write a book, a comprehensive exploration of family-enabled affairs, drawing on neuroscience and psychology and sociology and feminist theory, interviewing dozens of women who had experienced similar betrayals, creating a framework for understanding why families sometimes choose to protect the person causing harm rather than the person being harmed. Why women sometimes participate in the betrayal of other women. Why our cultural narratives about loyalty and family often serve to protect dysfunction rather than health. And the work of writing this book was transformative for Alina. It required her to think deeply about her experience, to place it in a larger context, to see the patterns that cut across individual stories, to understand the systemic forces that made her story not just personal but political. Not just individual but collective. The book was published to strong reviews. It struck a chord with readers who had been through similar experiences, who finally had language for what had happened to them, who felt validated and seen and understood. And Alina began to receive invitations to speak, to teach workshops, to appear on podcasts, to contribute to magazines and websites. And she found herself with a platform, with a voice, with an opportunity to influence the larger conversation about relationships and betrayal and recovery. And she used this platform carefully, responsibly, always grounding her insights in research and lived experience, always acknowledging complexity and nuance, always refusing to offer easy answers or quick fixes, always honoring the fact that healing is a process, not a destination, that recovery takes time and work and support, that there are no shortcuts through grief and trauma, that the only way out is through. She remained in therapy, even years later, even after she felt substantially healed, because she understood that therapy wasn't just for crisis. It was for ongoing growth and self-awareness. It was for catching patterns before they became problems. It was for maintaining the psychological and emotional health she had worked so hard to build. And her therapist became not just a helper but a witness, someone who had seen her at her worst and had helped her find her way to her best. Someone who held the full arc of her journey and could remind her when she needed reminding of how far she had come, of how much she had survived, of the strength and resilience and wisdom she had cultivated through one of the hardest experiences a person can face. Alina's relationship with David deepened and stabilized. They moved in together, they built a life together, a life based on mutual respect and honest communication and shared values, a life that felt completely different from her marriage to Marco. And sometimes Alina would marvel at the difference, would think about how she had lived for 14 years in a relationship that required constant accommodation and suppression and performance. And how she was now living in a relationship that required honesty and vulnerability and authentic presence, and how much easier the second way was, how much less exhausting, how much more sustainable, how much more real. And she understood that the hard work of recovery, the painful work of facing herself and changing her patterns and learning to honor her own knowing, had made this new relationship possible, had made her capable of choosing differently, of showing up differently, of insisting on something real rather than accepting something performed. The question of whether she would ever speak to Marco again, whether they would ever have any kind of relationship even as distant acquaintances, remained open. They shared no children, no ongoing obligations, no reason to remain in contact, and so they simply existed in separate worlds, occasionally hearing about each other through mutual acquaintances, knowing the basic outlines of each other's lives but not the details, and this seemed right to Alina, seemed like the appropriate distance. Seemed like the natural consequence of a betrayal so complete that it had severed all bonds. And she had no bitterness about this, no lingering wish for connection or closure. She simply accepted that some relationships end completely, that some people are only meant to be in your life for a season, and that sometimes the ending is so definitive that there's no going back, no possibility of friendship or cordial distance, just clean separation, just the complete closing of a chapter. Just the full turning of a page. On the 5-year anniversary of the day she canceled the credit cards, Alina threw a party, a celebration of survival and transformation. She invited the women from her support group, the friends who had stood by her through the worst, her therapist, David, her colleagues, her students, anyone who had been part of her journey toward wholeness. And as she stood in her apartment, surrounded by people who knew her story and loved her anyway, who celebrated her strength and her vulnerability, who witnessed both her brokenness and her healing, Alina felt a kind of peace she had never imagined possible in those early days of devastation. A sense that she had not just survived but had transformed, had become more herself, had found a kind of freedom and authenticity that only comes through the fire of profound loss and the commitment to rebuild from ashes. And she raised a glass and gave a toast, thanking everyone for being part of her story, for holding her when she couldn't hold herself, for believing in her when she couldn't believe in herself, for reminding her that she was more than what had been done to her, that she had the power to choose her own story, to write her own ending, to create a life of her own design. And in that moment, surrounded by love and support and genuine connection, Alina understood that the cancellation of those 6 credit cards, that act that had seemed so small and vindictive to the people who couldn't understand it, had actually been the beginning of everything. It had been the first moment when she chose herself, when she refused to participate in her own diminishment, when she drew a line and said no more. And from that moment had grown everything else. All the healing, all the growth, all the transformation, all the love, all the life she was now living, a life that was entirely her own. A life built on truth rather than deception, on self-respect rather than self-abandonment, on clear boundaries rather than constant accommodation. A life that was smaller in some ways, but infinitely larger in the ways that mattered, in authenticity and integrity, in the capacity to show up fully as herself without apology or performance. And she knew, standing there with her glass raised and her heart full and her future open, that she had done something remarkable. She had not just survived betrayal, she had used it as a catalyst for the most profound transformation of her life. And that transformation was not something anyone could take from her. Not Marco, not Claudia, not anyone, because it belonged completely and only to her. It was hers to keep forever.